When I was 9 years old, I heard for the first time the two words that would change my life forever: Alzheimer's disease. These two words would have a lasting impression on my future. It was at that time that my grandpa was diagnosed with this devastating disease. After watching the effects of this disease on both my grandpa and my family, it has caused me to want to learn more about the changes that are happening to resolve this disease. Although this disease has different stages that can already be slowed by some medications, ethical research to find a cure would be most promising. This disease is one that has no cure, and I consider finding a cure to be of high importance for researchers. While research is highly important, with people with deteriorating mental status, being able to get this research started tends to have some roadblocks. Disease is most commonly defined as a condition that can result in significant medical symptoms in humans. With Alzheimer's, the symptoms the patient can have cause a gradual decline in the patient's cognitive abilities. It is projected that approximately every 70 seconds, a person in the United States is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Therefore, if we could find a cure to this disease, fewer people would be affected by it, and many people would be able to continue their lives normally. Much like any disease, the progression of Alzheimer's happens in stages. While these stages can happen at any rate, not every person has all the symptoms as the next person affected by the disease. There are three main stages: mild, moderate, and severe. The progression of this disease can be very aggressive or can be slow. In either case, there is still no cure, making this disease very devastating. Thus being stated, if there was a cure to be found, then when a person has been diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's, rather than struggling with this disease, they could be treated and returned back to their normal living. Although there is not a cure for Alzheimer's, there are some medications that patients can take to slow down the progression of the effects of this disease. While these drugs seem to slow the symptoms down, it is hard to tell if they are actually giving the patient any benefit because no one knows what they would be like without the medications. In spite of the fact that there are drugs that can help slow the regression of the mind of those that have Alzheimer's, there is still no cure. As the baby boom generation is entering the time in which this disease is most commonly affecting people, the strength of research has been significantly increasing as the generation ages. Even while the research is increasing, unfortunately they are finding little hope when it comes to prevention and a cure. With this age group being such a large part of the population, the research is being encouraged by this group, which will hopefully give it more exposure and cause for there to be a faster cure. As in any case of research, the person being tested must be able to comply with the testing that is being done on them. Finding a way in which it is found to be ethical and practical to perform tests on patients with dementia, it is found to be very difficult. Prior to performing any research on any subject, researchers must confirm that the patient is compliant with the test to be performed. Federal regulations require that the people being tested are not vulnerable, such as the people with Alzheimer's. They get special attention to whether they are complying with these actions. These challenges that are being faced are causing the researchers to find ways that they can involve people with cognitive difficulties, but also meet the public view as being ethical. This is important because in order for research findings to be seen as truthful, the patients taking part of the research must be able to consent to treatment. With the practicality of involving a person with cognitive problems, the recurring issue of being ethical closely follows that of the practicality. The American Psychological Association released an official statement a decade ago, stating that the purpose of attending to assessment of the capacities of potential research subjects is to ensure that only subjects capable of giving consent are asked to make decisions about research participation. This protects both subjects' interests and the integrity of the research process. This statement works perfectly for those patients that are still in the early stages of their disease and are still capable of understanding what they are being researched for and what outcome of their research could be. In a study by the University of Pennsylvania, they did a study on more than 500 elderly people. They found that 92% of those in the study would consent to being in a study that consisted of blood draws. and that 75% would consent to a lumbar puncture. This shows that if the patient is still in normal cognitive settings, that the majority of people would agree to these studies if they thought it would be of some help towards research. When there is the instance that the person is introduced to the research after the impairment has already taken place, researchers have begun to accept the approval of the person to be involved in research after the consent has been signed by a healthcare proxy. A healthcare proxy is a family member or a friend that is in charge of making proper medical decisions for the patient. While this is becoming accepted, it is very rarely used and allowed, where the patient will not be placed in more risk than what they would be placed in a daily situation. It is being allowed. It is at this point in the person's life that the health proxy becomes the key that they tend to need in the stages of moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease. While this form of consent by the healthcare proxy is very appealing to researchers because it gives researchers the opportunity to do research on those patients that are no longer able to consent for themselves. In the case of Cruzan versus Missouri Department of Health, the parents of a young girl who went into a vegetative state and had not released information to her family with the request she would have for a situation such as this, her family was unable to take her off the life support due to the court finding insufficient reasoning that is what the girl would want. Much like a person with Alzheimer's disease, she was not able to give consent for her treatment. After going to the Supreme Court, they were able to come to realize that this is what that the family should be able to be her healthcare proxy. If it was passed in all states, this could give greater opportunities for researchers to do studies on those that are not currently eligible to give consent for their own treatment. Watching a family member change into somewhat of a stranger is one of the most painful things possible. As a family dealing with this dreadful disease, we watched as my grandpa changed from a pleasant man to a man that no longer recognized us. This disease took over my grandpa at a very rapid pace. Eventually, my grandma was no longer able to take care of him, and we moved him into a nursing home. Had we been given the opportunity to do research on him, I think that we would have taken that opportunity to see if it would have helped him or benefited people in the future. Therefore, I would like to think that much like our family, many other families would also be willing to give consent for their family members to take part in research to help themselves and others. With the different stages of Alzheimer's, we find that there are also different medications that can be used for treatment of this devastating disease. Also, there is research that is taking place that is faced with the challenge of patients being tested that are unable to consent for their own treatment. The ethical basis of this research causes some loopholes for researchers, but the proxy option for families gives research a new hope. As a family member faced with this disease, you realize how unremorseful this disease becomes as it takes over your loved one's mind. With this disease not having a cure, it is the research that continues that I hope will someday find that cure to this awful disease.